You are listening to the Oddities of Violence podcast, a podcast about ideas and events from the margins of terrorism, genocide, and the philosophy of violence. This podcast is recorded at the CJSW 90.9 FM studios at the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is comprised of the Siksika, Piikani and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Your hosts are Gavin Cameron, Josh Goldstein and Maureen Hebert. We're all on faculty here at the Department of Political Science. Just a caution before we get started. This podcast is for a mature audience and deals with topics, commentary and depictions of events that some listeners may find difficult or distressing. Hello everyone, welcome to the Oddities of Violence podcast. I'm your host Gavin Cameron. I'm joined as usual by my co-hosts Maureen Hebert. Hi Maureen.
Hey Gavin, hi everyone.
And Josh Goldstein.
Hi Josh. Gavin. Hey Maureen.
Great to be with you in the studio again. In this episode, we're probing the margins of terrorism. We'll be having a conversation about incel violence and how it challenges our understanding of what constitutes terrorism and the concept of the political within political violence. Joining us today is one of our Oddities of Violence workshop contributors, Jacob Ware. Jacob joins us from the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Hi, Jacob.
Hi, Gavin. Good to be with you.
Oh, thanks for being here, and it's nice to talk to you. Jacob is a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he studies domestic and international terrorism and counterterrorism. Together with Bruce Hoffman, he's the author of God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America, which is forthcoming from Columbia University Press. In his addition to his work at CFR, Jacob is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he teaches a class on domestic terrorism. He holds an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown and an MA Honours in International Relations and Modern History from the University of St Andrews, which is also where I went to grad school. So it's very exciting to have you here on that basis as well, Jacob.
Good to hear.
Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of your argument and your case analysis, I'd like to take a step back and get a sense of your academic origin story. How did you become interested in your broader research focus in terrorism and the theme for today?
Sure. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be involved in the project. So my interest in terrorism really stems, I think, from being the very proud graduate of two universities that have, I think, distinguished themselves as really counterterrorism powerhouses. University of St Andrews. We have the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence, which is a well-known program. And then I'm a graduate, as you mentioned, of the Security Studies program at Georgetown University, which has a very strong and distinguished terrorism studies program. So I have kind of had no choice based on my educational journey. A personal interest in this stems from when I was a teenager, and a pretty devastating terrorist attack occurred in Oslo, in Norway, in 2011. I am a Swedish citizen by birth, so that was something that affected a lot of us in that region of the world very deeply, in terms of just being such a clear example of the brutality and barbarity of terrorism in its purest form. The fact that somebody could ambush and hunt children to such a devastating and lethal effect, that is hard to shake, I think. And so I had an interest in neo-Nazi and white supremacist extremism and terrorism really since before it became a major national security issue in the US, where I now work. So by the time 2019 kind of came around, and this was a central issue for us working in the terrorism space, it had been a personal and professional interest of mine for a long time.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. And before we sort of get going on the implications of your case, can you briefly just explain to our listeners what it is that we're talking about today? Can you just briefly explain the concept of incel violence? What is it? How does it differ from other types of violence? What are some of the leading examples of it?
Sure. So let me start off by talking through incel ideology, what it means at its core. The incel ideology is based on the concept of involuntary celibacy, which is the idea that certain physical or biological or social or mental characteristics prevent men from having access to some kind of sexual marketplace. Now, they argue that that marketplace is dominated by so-called Chads and Stacys, who are the kind of idealized, hypersexualized men and women who exclude incels from participating from this space. Women are portrayed as irredeemably shallow and single-minded, making mating decisions based purely on physical factors such as attractiveness, height, and race. And if men did not win that genetic lottery, they're doomed to languish without access to that sexual marketplace forever. So, of course, the result from that is an embittered community of male online forum dwellers who perceive themselves to be social outcasts and turn their ire primarily against women, but also against men and couples. I'm happy to kind of talk through some of the nuances in the violence that we see, but let me first point to the two main incel incidents that we've seen that have defined the violence that this movement has perpetrated. The first occurred in 2014 on a university campus in California, University of California, Santa Barbara, where an individual stabbed his 3 male roommates to death in their apartment before proceeding on a shooting and car ramming rampage, first at a sorority house on the campus, and then throughout the streets of that town. 6 people were murdered before the individual took his own life. The second incident that is probably familiar, I would think, to Canadian audiences, in part because we've just had the 5-year anniversary this month, was a van ramming attack that occurred in Toronto in, or it might be last month actually, April 2018, where an individual drove his rented van down Yonge Street seeking to kill Chads, and he ended up killing 10 people, 10 of whom were women. Those are the 2 notorious incidents that we've seen, but we've seen several other attacks over the years that have varying degrees of inceldom as a central factor.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, I'm reluctant to get bogged down in sort of this discussion with definitions of terrorism, because basically we would never sort of move on to anything else. But there is a debate within the literature on whether incel violence should be considered terrorism. And just so we sort of understand your perspective, do you see incel violence as a form of terrorism, or if so, why? And if not, perhaps why?
I do. So let me start with a very quick kind of generic definition of terrorism. Usually, I take the definition of my colleague Bruce Hoffman, another St. Andrews veteran. He writes that terrorism is, first of all, political. It's violence. It's perpetrated by a non-state actor, and it's designed to spread some kind of psychological fear within a targeted community. So those are the 4 definitions that you'll see across. Those are the 4 elements that you'll see across most definitions. Now, if you go down that list, an incident like the Santa Barbara attack, where an individual released a manifesto clearly kind of outlining his ideology, hits on basically all of those categories. Now, the debate tends to be on the first of those elements, which is the political factor, political or ideological. Some would argue that incel violence doesn't have a clear political element, in terms of there's no real policy designed outcome here, right? Typically, incel violence isn't really designed to provoke some kind of political change. And that's true. But that doesn't mean that there's not an ideology that underpins it, that includes an in-group that defines an out-group and targets them with violence. So I believe that there's enough here to delineate incel violence as an ideology, and therefore as political violence, and therefore as terrorism.
Yeah, and I mean the distinction you're making there is also characteristic of quite a lot of right-wing violence as well, that is interested in creating social change. So it's sort of political in the broader sense, but not necessarily in the sort of electoral or sort of governmental sense. So social change as a political act is, I think, a fairly common way of interpreting that political piece within definitions of terrorism.
I would agree.
Yeah. When we talk about incel violence, are we really talking about a new phenomenon, do you think? Or are we talking about a new name for an older phenomenon? Because there's been violence against women and mass casualty violence against women well before the concept of incel violence. So do you think that this is a new thing, or is this simply we're recategorizing something that has a relatively long history?
Well, I think that's one of the challenges that those of us working on this issue have faced a little bit, is trying to analyze that recategorization, and I would reframe it as their recategorization as opposed to our recategorization, while still aiming to place it within that broader history that you refer to. Let me give a disclaimer on my studies into this topic, and that is that in my experience, there's really 4 categories of scholars who study incels. One is the security community, the counterterrorism community, and that's where I come from. And we look at radicalization and tactics and targeting and the violence when it emerges on scene. Secondly, you have the feminist community, who are looking more at societal structures and the patriarchy and issues like toxicity and that longer history of violence. Third, you have psychologists who look more at mental health and vulnerabilities and susceptibilities. And fourth, you have linguists who look at language and how it manifests in the online spaces. So there is a rich tradition of scholarship that has looked at this and has looked at this issue over time and has placed incels within that broader history. I try to incorporate that into my work as much as I can, while looking more into how incels are similar or different to other manifestations of political violence that we see today. So how they are similar in the trends that we see in the violence to, for example, the violent far right that you mentioned earlier, or jihadist violence.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the moves within terrorism studies in the last few years has been to look at older forms of violence and to ask whether we should recategorize that to sort of be within the terrorism bracket. And so, for example, there's been work on whether we should look at the US in the latter half of the 19th century and sort of violence against African Americans, for example, about whether that constituted terrorism. So there's a sort of wider move within terrorism studies here. If we accept that attempt to critically reappraise what constitutes terrorism, why do you think this sort of violence, whether we talk about it as incel violence or whether we talk about it as something else, why do you think it's been sort of underrepresented within our understandings of what constitutes terrorism?
That's a tough question. I think it's probably because we conceptualize terrorism as mass casualty attacks. So a lot of the more recent acts of incel terrorism, for example, like the two I mentioned earlier, they can be kind of subsumed under this broader understanding that we have of ISIS attacks and white supremacist attacks, and we can see the through lines. A lot of the violence that, for example, the feminist community would point to as being what they call everyday terrorism hasn't necessarily involved that mass casualty element, and so we haven't thought of it in those terms. This is something that I've tried to grapple with in my work on incels. I mean, I've co-authored an article where we outlined a typology of the violence, and one of the categories that we called ex post facto inceldom, which was really acts that in anything but the name that we gave them were exactly the same story. And there's a prominent one in Canada from, I believe, 1989. Yep. A mass shooting that occurred in Montreal at a university, right, where an individual by the name of Marc Lepine walked into a university there and separated in a classroom the men from the women, and he murdered 14 women in that classroom. Yep. That is quite easy looking back to think about as an act of terrorism, but I think partly because maybe, I don't know, maybe those cases weren't as common, or maybe it's just because of that discussion we had earlier about whether we consider misogyny and male supremacy to be ideological enough in its own right to be considered terrorism. Maybe that's the key element there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When that episode happened at the École Polytechnique, these were engineering students, right? So these were women engineering students who were shot. It seems to be that the reaction wasn't to think about it as a terrorist attack. Right. The way it was dealt with was as a gun control issue, right, interestingly. One thing I'd like to do is sort of return to the way that incels talk about the identity of the people that they are most vexed about and against whom they use some forms of violence. So in this podcast, we've returned in the discussion of different forms of violence to the role that identity construction plays, so how perpetrators see themselves, how they conceptualize their victims or their targets, and how perpetrators understand the relationship between themselves and their victims. So as you pointed out, in incel ideology and violence, we have the identities of the Stacys and the Chads. And what I find curious about this is that there's two rather different formulations here that have a different kind of grappling with the actual material conditions of actual real life. So the Stacys, in a kind of general way, are portrayed as being quite powerful because of the feminist movement, even though in real life, women still often are subordinate to men in many ways in terms of, pay for equal work, representation in political institutions and boardrooms, the reality of the double shift of employment and then household, childcare, elder care duties, and so on. But as you pointed out, when it comes to the Chads, these targets of incel animus are privileged men who really are quite powerful in the real world. They have all the political, economic, and social power afforded to men that's further bolstered by their wonderful physical appearance. So with the women, there's a pronounced disconnect, it seems, between material conditions in the real world versus how incels see them. And this constitutes what Eric Vogelin, the political philosopher that we heard about in an earlier episode from our contributor Barry Cooper, called a second reality, a kind of fantastical reality. But with the so-called Chads, the material conditions of the real world and incel perceptions of these men do seem to align. So maybe you could talk, if you wouldn't mind, a little bit more about how incels construct the Stacey and Chad identities and how they grapple with the objective conditions of the real world, or is it really the case that the real world isn't actually part of this calculation?
Another scholar, you mentioned a scholar who's worked on this, another great scholar who's done excellent work on this is a feminist scholar by the name of Michael Kimmel. who writes about something he calls aggrieved entitlement.
Mm.
And I think that's something that captures this idea, right? There is a certain economic and social and political power that these men in the incel movement feel that they have been promised by virtue of their sex. And they've arrived at a stage in life, evidently, where for whatever reason, in their minds, it's their looks. There are probably real reasons why there are real grievances. They have found that those entitlements are not forthcoming. Those, in this case, the sexual entitlements are not forthcoming. And I think that explains a little bit why you have this buildup of rage within them, to try to respond, in this case, violently to that perceived humiliation, that perceived emasculation. I'll point out that I think you see this core idea of aggrieved entitlement in other forms of violence too. You see it in white supremacists who are inspired by something we call great replacement theory,
yes.
Where they see themselves as superior white men who, again, have been promised a certain set of political, economic, social, sexual riches based on their presence, their status as white men, only to find that for whatever reasons those are not forthcoming. And so they lash out violently against another target that they blame, in their case, the Black community or the Jewish community. I think that's the best way of thinking through how somebody who perhaps fundamentally understands the advantages that they have been given might react violently when those advantages seem to be taken away from them.
Yeah, I think it kind of echoes, the idea of, in prospect theory, of loss, being in the domain of losses, and then kind of subsequent loss compensation, right? That there's a society, and maybe this is a sort of a question in and of itself. Is it the case that incels sort of see that men have lost a previous status in society because of the feminist movement, and then it's a kind of in being in the domain of losses, as this theory suggests, that is coupled with a kind of humiliation, or is it more a matter of their own kind of particular situation that they think that they find themselves in? So not all men are on the losing end of feminism, only themselves. Is that the better way to think about it?
I think it's a little bit of both. So definitely we see strong anti-feminism elements within the incel community, and the incel community in itself is a reactionary response to advances in women's rights and women's social and economic advancement. So that's certainly one thing, right? There is that ideological groundswell among these men who say that we have to respond as a community against the rise of feminism, which is taking away our rights. But there is also that more personal element. And I think, you mentioned whether this was something that only they see that they're the victims. That's part of it. But I also think that personal grievances, in general, personal vulnerabilities play a very big role in the incel community. So we see very high levels of mental illness, including autism, depression disorder, including depression. We see high levels of a history of being bullied. We see very frequently histories of violence in the home, where an individual might be a victim of violence in the home. We see these individuals come out of broken homes as well. So I think to an extent, there's also that personal element of, we have this overarching worldview. We have people who are moving through the world and are not satisfied with their lot, and are often dealing with some legitimate and very painful vulnerabilities. And they encounter this worldview, this mentality, this ideology that allows them to affix blame for their own pain on an outgroup. And in the worst cases, obviously, as we've seen, they target that outgroup with violence, and that violence is the explosion of a response to that aggrieved entitlement. It's a response to the humiliation and the emasculation that these individuals have felt.
One of the things that I think that, at least it seems to me, that marks perhaps incel ideology and then, the kind of steps before violence occur, is that seems to be very much a kind of social media or kind of online kind of movement or existence. So I wonder if you could just maybe address two maybe related questions. One is, do you think that social media fosters a particular form of isolation that then kind of facilitates radicalization? So you have a group of people who are online in this kind of very kind of closed social media echo chamber, and then they just kind of talk amongst themselves, and this kind of brings out the most radical views perhaps among them. And then the second related question is, how does the incel movement's use of social media compare, for example, to jihadi terrorist groups like the Islamic State, which, as I understand it, at least in its heyday, used social media quite extensively for recruitment and radicalization, aimed, at least in part, in drawing in individuals to carry out lone wolf attacks in the West, if they weren't able to actually go to live in Syria and Iraq under the Islamic State?
I think one of the reasons why incel ideology is so dangerous and why it has expanded so much in a social media age is because it's fundamentally self-reinforcing. So if you are traveling through the world and you think that you are somewhat isolated, somewhat lonely, you're not really making a lot of friends in the real world, you're certainly having trouble developing romantic or sexual relationships with women, then retreating into that online space and shutting the offline world out and turning away from your offline relationships is only going to compound that grievance. So you see a lot of people a lot of young incels in the incel chat rooms who engage in kind of self-radicalizing behavior and language, where they're almost a support system for each other to commiserate about how hard life is outside these chat rooms. And the irony, obviously, is that when you are spending your life angry in these communities and spending all your time online and developing a really violently, virulently misogynistic view against women, then that is that much more unlikely to actually result in offline relationships that these individuals are seeking. So that's the kind of irony, and I think that's why social media has played such a big role in compounding this threat and spreading it wider. With regards to how incels differ or are similar to other extremist movements, I think fundamentally it's a relatively similar experience in the sense that they primarily gather online. They employ both mainstream social media platforms as well as more niche or specific chat rooms to spread their ideology both more broadly in terms of a wider radicalization opportunities, and also more deeply in terms of really developing that ideology in more closed spaces. One difference with kind of jihadist groups or far-right groups is sometimes in those networks we see more centralized propaganda production. So the Islamic State, for example, still plays a role in disseminating propaganda with the group. We see that as well in the far-right space. With incel, and then the community, the foot soldiers will participate and spread that wider, and they'll start off a conversation about the outgroup. With incels, there is no central directional coordination at all. There never has been, and there probably never will be. There is no such thing as incel terrorist groups. So this is a completely decentralized, diffuse network, and the propaganda that comes out, the radicalization that comes out, is all grassroots, and it's all about, again, this very twisted and very aggressive and very misogynistic support network that is trying to answer real or perceived grievances that these individuals have in their personal lives offline, and mobilizing individuals who have those grievances against an outgroup along the lines of this violent ideology.
Now, this kind of, in some ways, you've answered my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and you can kind of tell me whether my impression here is correct or not. So my impression is that incels are looking in part for, some kind of online community, as you said, to kind of commiserate with each other. Although interestingly, they spend a lot of that time, expressing their situation of like continued loneliness and isolation and so on. But I also wondered if, despite its diffuse kind of status as a movement, even if we want to call it that, are they also looking for some kind of source of authority in individuals like Jordan Peterson, for example? So would it be accurate to say that Peterson is somehow part of or looked up to within the incel movement, and do incels look to him or other individuals as a source of authority and leadership, or are they not really looking for that kind of thing?
I think Jordan Peterson is seen by some in the movement as a voice for them, as a kind of a mainstreamed intellectual who can express some of the grievances that they share. But I think the more important element is the sense of belonging and purpose and community that a lot of individuals get when they engage in these forums. And that's really hard to talk about. It's something that is really hard to talk about in counterterrorism writ large, because ultimately we're always talking about people who've committed horrific crimes and ruined people's lives and taken family members away. But some of these individuals are people who are really, really, really suffering, and that is real suffering. It's true suffering. It's legitimate suffering, and so this community gives those people a sense of belonging. Now, there is research ongoing right now, I haven't participated in it, that looks at some of these platforms as a de-radicalization element, because they actually give that community and that belonging, and that might be enough for some. Obviously, that always has to be tempered with the reality that we have seen legitimate acts of violence perpetrated by this community in the name of the ideology and the tenets that they rally around. And that is a really, really hard thing to balance, how much we think that these communities are a de-radicalizing impact and how much we think that they are a pathway to violence.
And you have now actually anticipated the final question I will ask before I give it to Josh. And that is basically de-radicalization programs sort of, by society, authorities, that kind of thing. So the Calgary Police Service, in our city here, have a program called Redirect. And I gather it's designed to engage in sort of de-radicalization. I think mostly it was designed to head off, jihadi radicalization. Are there programs that you know of that are designed for people who are drawn to the incel kind of ideology and potentially could become violent or have become violent? And if these kind of programs exist, are they similar to, is the program or the way to de-radicalize somebody similar to how it would work for potential or jihadi terrorist recruits, or are these two groups of people sufficiently different that the de-radicalization programs for incels would have to look or do look considerably different?
So first of all, let me say yes. there are programs, and I do want to say I always think it's important to do this when we talk about incels. If any listeners are listening to this conversation and they think they have people in their lives who are vulnerable or who are on this pathway, reach out to somebody. There are support services who work on this very explicitly, and there is help out there. So do not feel like this is. I mean, it is an enormous challenge, and it's very difficult to work on de-radicalization. But these support systems do exist, and they can be reached. So please feel free to reach out to this team, and we can put you in touch with people. So let me first say. So I'll answer your second question first, which is more about how applicable this is to other ideologies. In my experience, most organizations that work on de-radicalization tend not to deal with ideologies at all.
Interesting.
So whether somebody's an incel or whether somebody is a jihadist or whether somebody's a white supremacist, these organizations typically say that doesn't actually matter. What really matters is the fact that behind that ideology, there is a reason why somebody is getting attracted to extremism and to anger and hatred, as opposed to the alternative. So most of these groups tend to work on trying to identify and then address whatever those vulnerabilities or susceptibilities are, whether it's, like I said earlier, mental health, whether it's a history of just being lonely and bullied, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's an abusive parent. In most of these de-radicalization cases, social workers or psychiatrists or law enforcement will approach these individuals, and the first task will be to try to identify not what the ideology is, but why the ideology is an answer for this person. And then they work on these issues. So to answer your question, yes, right, it is translatable, because very frequently we see the same underlying grievances, whether somebody's an incel or whether somebody's a white supremacist or whether somebody's a jihadist. And that's especially true in a social media age, where I argue the barriers to entry to extremism have lowered, where now we're frequently seeing 16-year-olds whose personal grievances are awful and totally normal, and rather than reach out to the usual support services that we all grew up with in our lives, they are turning to support services online who are feeding them noxious ideologies and bringing them into their fold instead of broader society's fold. So that, to answer that question, yes, it's translatable. De-radicalization, as I mentioned earlier, is really hard. So is counter-radicalization. And I'll just point to two reasons why it's hard. One is, I'll point to three reasons actually. One is, no two stories are ever the same. So there is no one theory of radicalization. There's no one theory of de-radicalization. So even if something worked perfectly with one case, it might not work perfectly with the other case. Two is metrics, right? It's really hard to know, first of all, that somebody has de-radicalized, because we don't actually know what that means, right?
Right.
On the one hand, you can say, well, somebody who's not violent anymore is demobilized, and that might be enough, right, from a pure counterterrorism standpoint, but they might still be a vicious incel,
right?
And so you still have a radicalization and extremism problem. So that's one issue on the metrics. The other is it's also just really hard to know, to measure disengagement, because when this movement is fully online, you're not talking about neo-Nazis who, have disengaged from, who are not going to concerts anymore and who have erased their Nazi tattoos, right? You're talking really about people who are stepping away from the forums. And how can you ever count that?
Right.
How can you ever know perfectly how many people you actually put on that pathway out of the movement? Without that kind of metric, it's hard to get government funding, for example, because you can't prove, right, in an ideal de-radicalization and counter-radicalization world, you can never prove how many there were, because there would be none. So it's hard from that angle. The third element is scale, because these interventions that individuals do, that organizations work on, often involve, at the very least, one-to-one human work. Often it's teams that will work on one individual. And when you're talking about across the radicalization spectrum, I don't know, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people who are engaged in extremist rhetoric online and offline, you are just not going to be able to scale up to handle that unless you have millions of social workers specifically focused on extremism, which we don't have. So it is quite de-radicalization programming is quite possibly the best tool we have to get people out of these movements and get them on a better path. But it is really difficult, and it's difficult to measure, and it's difficult to scale.
Great. It's been a really, really fascinating conversation. And I remember that Maureen and I were in Toronto, and we were normally, we have lived in Toronto a whole bunch of years, and we're back there. Maureen had an event that she was at, and it was in North York where the incel attack in 2018 had happened. It was, I think, a year later. And I remember the kind of shock of realization, oh wait, this is the part of Yonge Street where it happened. And then we found the memorial to the victims, and there's something about the poignancy of this relatively small number, still incredibly tragic, a number of victims, and a little. At that point, they were just kind of human-sized, white kind of abstractions, forms that were set up as a temporary memorial, and it was a very moving, very powerful, and kind of visceral thing, almost more than 9/11, because the numbers, are in some ways so big. It's hard to keep the reality, the visceralness of it in front of you. And I remember being struck by that. So it's kind of bringing back those sorts of thoughts. And I guess I want to focus on some of these ideas that you've just been mentioning, Jacob, about the weight of ideas in the lives of incels. And I think one thing that when you first are reading about the incel movement that strikes one is the very elaborate, almost Baroque vocabulary that's invoked, very complex relations between these categories and so on. And it seems to involve a well-worked-out view, or what has the appearance of a kind of well-worked-out view of the world. And at the center of it, at least it appears from the outside, is an idea of sexual entitlement, but of a very particular sort. And I'm wondering if you could begin by telling us, what does this idea of sexual entitlement involve for the incels? That is, what form of relations, of satisfactions, of life would meet the demands of saying, now my life is on track, now I am living the way I ought to live?
That's a tremendous question that might be better suited for an incel himself, because I can't answer that for you. I think, the sexuality element is one, but I think it's also, as I mentioned earlier, these are reactionary individuals, and they, like many extremist and terrorist groups, right, they quote unquote yearn for the old days. They want to see a society where women are controlled and belonging in the home, and take care of their men, and take care of the home, and sexually satisfy their men, and that's their job, and that's life. You get various levels of, I think, extremist interpretations of that and solutions for that, and that will depend on the individual. Some people, for example, will argue for like a mass imprisonment of women, because they have reached a point where they fundamentally have lost the right to make their own decisions, because women are so depraved. That is kind of one, extreme, and then there are those who really just have that kind of core grievance of loneliness and sadness and yearning for company, and they have, I don't know, such a tough time engaging with their own personal traumas, that it's just easier for them to adapt this really hateful ideology and blame somebody instead of really reflect on their own shortcomings. So it's a really good question, and I think it's tough to really put yourself in the minds of these people sometimes and try to translate.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, and it is one of the really difficult obligations of the sort of work that we all do to say this is really distasteful, and distasteful undersells it, but yet there's a kind of a logic. There's something going on that isn't just random, that isn't just insanity, that there is something there, and a kind of obligation to say, okay, well, what allows it to make sense? And one sort of on this idea, one interesting thing that struck me as you were talking is this emphasis on the sexual marketplace, that is the idea that there's some kind of societal factor at work. And also the idea, which didn't come up yet in our conversation, of the blue pill, the red pill, the black pill, an idea of a kind of sense of a kind of hidden reality that incels have access to. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about this emphasis on this blue pill, red pill, and even, I guess, black pill, and the idea that there's some structure, some force out there that individuals are battling against or being crushed by?
Yeah. So it's one of the great ironies, I think, of the incel ideology, that they really are, in a very, very niche way, they're like Marxists, right? Because they perceive there to be a class structure, and they're calling for a revolution. So they are sexual Marxists,
Right.
who are looking to completely upend this marketplace. That's first of all fascinating. The second element about the pills, maybe I should have mentioned this a bit earlier, because it is a key element of the ideology. Will be familiar to those of you who have watched The Matrix. Incels talk, as all kind of online extremists do. They'll talk about the blue pill and the red pill. The blue pill being the ability to continue to live in a world of illusion, with realities hidden from you, and the red pill being something that you can, an awakening that you can undergo in order to discover the truths about the world and your place in it. Obviously, the red pill for incels is, the idea that women are, single-minded and only care about certain characteristics, and that incels can never reach that. The black pill is something that's unique to incels, and in my view, it's probably the element that makes incel violence so deadly. The black pill states that not only will you be exposed to the realities of the world, but you will learn that there is fundamentally nothing you can do about it.
Okay.
You are doomed, and this is your lot, and it will be like this forever because you just didn't win the genetic lottery. Why does that matter? Because it's a nihilistic worldview, and once that's how you see the world and your place in it, it leads very, very quickly to really there's one outcome, and that's suicide. And
Right.
I always try to dwell on this for a moment in these conversations and note that we talk about terrorist attacks that incels have committed, and they're very important. But first and foremost, the greatest number of victims of incel violence by far, and it's not comparable, is incels themselves, right? We see massive levels of suicides within this community. And this impacts the violence too, because almost every act of incel violence that we see, including the Toronto van attacker, even though he survived, is an act of murder-suicide. The mentality that underpins this violence is very much, I am going to kill myself, it's your fault, and I'm going to take you down with me. And that leads to more lethal violence because, a suicidal terrorist, as we've seen with jihadist violence in the Western world, a suicidal terrorist can cause a lot more damage because he doesn't have to plan the most difficult part of a terrorist operation, which is getting away. So the black pill is an extremely damaging worldview that these individuals have, again, both to themselves and to the victims of their violence.
Wow. So we've talked about the relationship of the incel movement to other extremist movements, and I'm wondering if I could shift it a little bit and talk about the relationship, if any, between the incel movements and other political movements that have sex, sexual desire, sexual expression at their centerpiece. And we do have two very broad movements that I think everyone is familiar with. One that is centered around creating a private space, or at least a space away from state regulation and policing and oversight, to create a place in life in which one can live out one's desires and attractions. And we see that expressed in the movement towards same-sex marriage, towards the pro-choice movement, and so on, that my love, my body should not be regulated by society and by the state. And then we've seen a kind of more recently a real kind of counter movement with the appearance of a moral panic, in which all of those spaces away from state policing and regulation now are objects of attack, of attempted and real re-regulation, exclusion, that those spaces ought not to exist. The anti-trans, the pro-life sorts of movements that we've recently seen. So is it a coincidence? Is there a connection between these much more mainstream movements that have sex at their center and the rise of the incel movement?
I don't know. That's a fascinating question. For me, I think, I associate incel ideology with being something that is less organized, mainstream, and politicized, and being something that is more associated with kind of youthful just angers and frustrations. Incels are, young. Yep. Often very young. So, I've always thought of this as being more of a kind of a narrow, extremist manifestation of something that has always existed in our society. Okay. So, the idea. Listen, the reality is the idea that a 16-year-old straight boy is going to ask out a girl or make sexual advances on a girl and be turned away, that's not new. No. The fact that we have violence because of that rejection is not new either. Mm-hmm. But I do think the fact that we have an ideology that exists purely based on that slight, that is new. I think it's just given voice and given and radicalized that moment that is otherwise typically innocent and benign. It's taken that moment and it's created an enemy from it, and that is the thing that I feel is relatively novel with this ideology.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And this question, right? What gives it this weight, and why now? I think those are really, really interesting really interesting questions that I think you're getting at. So do you? And this is the last question I'll ask, and it's just purely speculative. Every movement begins somewhere, right? That communism as a movement begins, as a kind of fringe thing, and it gathers its adherents, it gathers its organization. Maureen mentioned this a little bit with Jordan Peterson and the sort of slow. I don't know enough about Jordan Peterson to say anything about his own intentions. I mean, he has mentioned in his own lectures how much he profits from his lectures, from his books. Quite a wealthy man by his own admissions because of it. So pure speculation, do you see the incel movement as a kind of an odd point in time, and we'll look back at this and go, can you believe that this was a thing, or is there a kind of dynamic and power to it that is, has the potential to go somewhere, to become a political movement?
So let me answer that question by reflecting for a second on something I've been thinking a lot about, which is a major issue that we face in the United States, and that is school shootings. You see a lot of incels who talk with great admiration about our lineage of school shooters in the US. Some of the incel attacks that we've seen, for example, one that I didn't discuss, which is a little bit wishy-washy, but it's the Parkland shooting that targeted a school. One of my concerns in this space is that a lot of those incidents, Columbine, Virginia Tech 2000, Columbine 1999, Virginia Tech 2007, Sandy Hook 2012, those were all before the incel movement emerged. And then the ones after that too. So Parkland 2018 was kind of incel related. Uvalde, which is the 1 year anniversary tomorrow, certainly is one of those. I worry that the incel movement, the incel ideology, has given a name to something that is a far bigger issue than any of us can really comprehend. The incel attacks we've seen are relatively narrow, where somebody says like, yep, this was my ideology. But when you look at the individuals and you look at their pathway, you look at their grievances, you look at their story, and you look at the kind of people they're targeting, there is not a big gulf between somebody like, Elliot Rodger, the Santa Barbara shooter, so school shooter, and somebody like the Virginia Tech shooter in 2007. They basically said the exact same thing. So to answer your question more directly, counterterrorism analysts usually think of threats as a nexus between intent and capability. You're really asking, I think, an intent question. I'm answering it a little bit with a capability answer. The reality is in the US, less so in Canada, but in the US, our capability is so high that these attacks are inevitable. And they're going to continue, whether we call it incel violence or not. There is absolutely no good reason to believe that we're going to stop seeing alienated, angry, sexually frustrated young men open fire on their classmates. That's just not going to stop until we get a grip on the capability question. Whether we call that quote unquote incel or not, I think, is ultimately a kind of an academic question as opposed to a practical question. I mean, the practicality of whether somebody can be classified as an incel or not when there's, 20 dead 6-year-olds in a school in Texas is kind of doesn't matter that much.
Right. Excellent.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us. It's been a fascinating, wide-ranging, and very thought-provoking conversation. So I really appreciate you talking to us this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Jacob.
Jacob will be here at the University of Calgary on June 8th and 9th, 2023 for our Oddities of Violence workshop, made possible through funding by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. If you want to know more about Jacob's work on incel violence, drop by, or you can live stream the workshop. Details will be on our Oddities of Violence website. You've been listening to the Oddities of Violence podcast. Join us for our next episode when we continue with our discussion of the oddities of violence. Our guest then will be Fanny Lafontaine from Laval University, who will be discussing genocide and international law, and your host for that will be Maureen Hebert. Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time.